I'm using the 3-Yard Quilt book by Donna Robertson and Fran Morgan, Quilts on the Double, for my adaptation of this Luminous Blooms quilt. I am using Luminous Blooms. This is from Benartex or Canvas in Benartex. And because this is not a full yard of fabric, I have to add on just a little bit. So I am using a regular black to add on to my panel. And then I am using for the quilt, which is the Stellar quilt right here, because I'm doing stars in there, I'm going to have these as the center of my little stars, and I'm going to have these as the branches of my stars. And then for my, instead of using a regular several different quilt borders, I am going to use this border fabric to border it. And so I'll show you how to do mitered corners. But because we're using a border fabric and it's a bit larger than what the fabric is called for in a 3-yard book, I do need a little bit more fabric. So I'll talk about that as we get to it and how much fabric I need. Before I get started, I want to make sure that I have all my measurements, everything ready to go before I start cutting. The panel that I want to put in these big, huge blocks here does not measure the right amount for the pattern. So I'm having to adjust that a little bit. If I'm adjusting this, that means I have to adjust the framing that goes around it. There are times when I have to actually put framing in order to make a quilt a little bit bigger or a block a little bit bigger. And so it's important for me to make sure I have all those measurements correct before I get started. My large pieces are going to go in these big blocks. They're a little bit larger than what this block calls for, so these have to be a little bit smaller. And then I'm also going to make sure that everything else is going to match. Luckily, this is just a print, and so for these, I can go ahead and do as the pattern suggests. Over here for my border, I am not going to have these two pieces. I am going to put on the border piece. That border piece is going to have to use a little bit more fabric because it has a layout of a larger print than what these two are combined. And so it will make my quilt just a little bit larger, and it makes it so I have to purchase a little bit more fabric. So I just want to make sure I have all the measurements right before I get started. I've cut my strips, my initial strips. I'm going to cut these into squares in just a moment. I've cut all my other little strips that are going to go around my framing here. These are the squares that are going to go into the stars. And then I have rough cut my panel, and I'm going to show you how to cut that panel down so that you have it in the exact measurements that you need it in. Sometimes you just need the right tool for the job to make everything more fun, if nothing else. So I have a stripology here to cut my squares. I am laying out my strips, and I can lay up to 3 or 4 strips, doubled, and be able to cut through all of them. And so I line them up on my cutting mat so that I've lined up with one of the lines. And then I can take my next strips and go ahead and line them up. And I have them on a line, and then I can bring out my stripology. The stripology has slits throughout so that I can cut up to 1/2 inch increments. I can actually cut up to 1/4 inch increments. So here we have, I've got it laid out. I've lined up my horizontal line here with my lines, and I've lined up here. I've also lined up so that my salvage is off to the edge here, so that I'm going to cut my salvage off as well. And I start by cutting off the salvage, and I go to the number that I need to cut my squares, and I can get a little carried away and do quite a few with absolutely no problem. So once I lift up my stripology, I have all my squares nicely cut and ready to go. I have rough cut all of my squares from my panel. Now I am going to cut them down. I'm using a 10-inch square. My design calls for a 10-inch square for my design. that is not the design that is called for in the pattern. And so if you're using this pattern to use this pattern, remember that I am altering things. So I'm using a 10-inch square because this has a really beautiful like blue in here. I wanted to make sure I got everything. And so I have made it quite a bit bigger than the squares that are in the pattern. So I am lining this up, and what I want to do is I want to make sure that it looks, this is the wonderful thing about using squaring rulers, is that I can see the pattern in my square here that's a 1/2 inch from the 10-inch. And so this is just beautiful. I can see the whole thing using the squaring ruler. And then I can make sure that I've got a diagonal line going through what appears to be the center, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm also using a rotating cutting mat so that I can rotate that as I go and hopefully not move my design any. So now I'm going to just simply start by cutting. It moved just a tad. So I always like to double check that it didn't go anywhere. And you always want to cut away from you. So that's what makes the glorious mat beautiful. And I can just see that design through this gorgeous 10-inch square. And now I am trimmed down. The last thing I need to do is get a line diagonally down one side of the squares that I'm going to turn into half square triangles. I have a black and I have this gorgeous pink purple, and I have a heat erasable friction pen. So my friction pen is going to show up better on my lighter fabric. So I am doing my line on the wrong side of the fabric, and I like to have that line because otherwise you don't have a guide. And so I am putting a line down the center, just like that, on each one of the light squares. I want to start putting my sashing strips or my framing strips on the top and the bottom of my blocks. So I made sure that all of them were lined up top and bottom in the right direction. And now I'm going to take my sashing strip and simply place it on top. I don't feel like for this that I actually need pins or anything, but if you feel like you need pins, then by all means, please do it. I'm making sure I leave enough of the selvage off the edge so I can cut that off later. And now I can just chain piece these through. Bringing in the next one right behind it. I do leave about a 1/2 inch in between each one so that I have plenty of room to snip and then be able to square off later. Once I get through, I simply snip those in half, and then I can start on the bottom side. Now that I have the top and the bottom sashing strip on, I'm going to trim off, because I rough cut with scissors, I'm going to trim off so that it lines up and remains square with my block. I'm going to do that with all 4 corners on each one. Then I can go through and I have a nice straight edge to put the sides on of my sashing slash border frame. All right, now that I've trimmed them all, I can put my sashing on going down the sides. I do that the same way, so I chain piece all of them as I go. To make the half square triangles, I'm placing them right sides together. I have the square that I have marked my diagonal stripe, and I'm going to make sure that I'm using a scant 1/4 inch. That way, when I'm opening up my triangles and squaring them off, I have a little bit more fabric to work with. And again, I can chain piece with this, so I'm going to get through with one and bring in the next one. I simply turned all my triangles or my squares over, and I'm going to go on the other side now. I haven't even taken them apart yet. I'm going to use my ruler and my rotary cutter to separate all these squares into my half square triangles. So I simply use that cut line, and now I have wonderful little squares here. Once I have my triangles cut, I can then open the dark fabric, open that right up just like that, and carefully press it. I want to be careful because this is a bias now and it could stretch out my fabric. Now that I'm pressed, I want to make sure that the size of my half square triangle square is the size it needs to be. I have a squaring ruler here, and it has a diagonal line going down the center. I want to line up my diagonal line with the diagonal line that's on my half square triangle. And then I'm looking for the vertical and horizontal lines that measure up to the size of the block that I want. I'm going to go ahead and trim off two sides. And then I flip my block. And now I put the markings of the vertical and the horizontal line, as well as that diagonal line on my square, and I trim off the other two sides. It's important to do this anytime that you're using this method for making half square triangles. Make sure that you have the correct size. It will save you time, frustration when you are sewing, and it will make everything look perfect. I have everything squared. All of my half square triangles are all squared and ready to go. So everything measures up perfectly. Now I have placed my star into the positions that I want all these blocks to go. And I'm going to put them together. These actually go wonderfully together and they're all the same. So I just simply stuck them into a pile and stitched all of them through the chain piecing method. So I'm going to finish that up and then we'll put the whole star together. When putting your half square triangles together, I have taken the bottom half square triangle and turned my pressed edge to the other side so that my seams will nest together. This is something that I simply do with my fingers and then I'll press out later before I stick it into the machine. Once I get all my half square triangles together in those twos, I'm going to go ahead and re-iron where I flipped this seam. And then I am going to go ahead and do my center seam as well while I'm here, so that everything looks perfect. Pressing as you go saves so much time. All of these are going to go together now like a 9-piece. So I have put my first two in here on the bottom. Then I'm going to put these two together. Oops. Take it all with me. And then these two. Now that I have my strips done, I am going to go ahead and press my seams. For my top and my bottom, my seam automatically wants to go outside. For the center, my seam wants to go to the inside. So that's exactly how I'm going to press them so that they'll nest nice and together when we finish the block. When I get to this point, I like to pin my nested seams together. That way everything stays in line and is easier to sew when I get it under the machine. And I'm going to go ahead and do both of these, but if I were doing my chain stitching, I would probably do all 6 at the same time and then turn them around and do all 6 at the same time. I have all of my main blocks squared, ready to go. I have all of my star blocks squared and ready to go. Time to put them all together. So I've laid it all out, and now I'm going to put my rows together. I put the bottom row and the middle row together already. Now I'm working on this row. I've already put my top row together, and what I'm looking for when I lay it out is that all of my pieces are right side up, because these definitely have butterflies that go in the up direction. So I'm making sure that all my flowers are upright, and then I start sewing my rows together. The larger the blocks become, the more important it is to pin. I like to make sure I'm definitely pinning my seams together, but then I also like to make sure I have one at the top and the bottom, simply because I want to make sure that these are going to stay where they are. And I am more likely for a block to not grow if I have pins there. My border is made out of this gorgeous border fabric. For a 3-yard quilt, this called for actually 2 yards of that. And so this quilt will end up being about 4 yards versus the 3-yard quilt, but it will also be bigger. I have a 10-inch pattern here. So I am going to take that 10-inch pattern, and the first thing I did was make sure that that 10-inch pattern was going to have at least 10 inches off of both ends, because I'm also going to miter this border to make it look really good. So now that I have everything cut out, I've actually pinned the long sides of my border. That will make it so that I have plenty to put on the top and the bottom with my border fabric. So when I pin this, I start by splitting it in half and pinning at the center, and then pinning at my ends. With a mitered corner, you want to make sure that you have 1/4 of an inch that you do not sew, so that that miter can happen. So I've put 2 pins there. That's my universal sign for making sure that I stop and don't go any further. And I've put 2 pins at the top and the bottom of both sides of my quilt. And I went ahead and pinned both sides of my quilt so that I can go to the machine and get it done really quickly. I'm ready for the top and bottom of my border. I have gone ahead and marked the center point, and I went ahead and measured exactly on the border, just so that I know from center to the edge of my quilt. Now I'm going to line up. I've folded this in half. This is my border. I folded that in half with the wrong sides together. I'm going to line up that center, line up that edge. And to keep this out of the way, I kind of like to pin it so that it doesn't go anywhere. And I do that on both sides. Remember, I want to keep 1/4 of an inch from the edge. So even though I have this marked as my edge, I'm going to come 1/4 of an inch in before I start pinning. Pin my center and do that middle, middle, middle. Now I'm going to do the same on this side. So I'm going to fold this over nice and neat and pin it in place so it doesn't go anywhere. And you can see how I stopped 1/4 of an inch from the end. I already have my center marked. So now I'm coming all the way down to the end and pinning in place. 1/4 from the end. And then middle, 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 and we'll go to the sewing machine. I have now folded the corner of my quilt so that it's 45 degrees going that way, and so that my border strips are lining up straight. I want to make sure that I have got a line here that's going to go directly 45 degrees. So I use my ruler that has a 45-degree angle on it, and I place that ruler directly on my seam line right here. Now I can line up here with the 45-degree angle that's going on my fold. I can also turn this over so that I can make sure that all of my lines and design are going in the right direction. Now I'm going to take a friction pen and mark along this line so that I have a sew line when I go to the machine. And when I go to pin this, I like to pin going in the direction that I'm going to go from the machine. I like to go from the corner so that I can reinforce that corner and make sure that I get all the fabric that I need and get to the directly to the seam. And this makes it so that everything stays in place without me having to pull any pins out while I'm stitching. Let's sew. When I was measuring for my line, I had my fabric for my seams pointed towards me. Now I'm going to point them away from me on both sides so that I can see where my seam meets and go directly into that seam. Since I'm going to be following the line, I have put my needle position back to the center. Makes it a little bit easier. So I can come directly down on that seam line for both the sides. And I'm going to go forward a couple stitches and then go back a couple stitches just to keep that nice and reinforced. Now I just follow my line. I've opened it up. Looks really good. A little bit down here that I could adjust, but I think up here it looks fantastic, so it's going to stay the way it is. Now I can trim this fabric off and work on the other three. Finishing a quilt needs to have the best binding possible. I like to use 2¼ inch strips to 2½ inch strips. 2½ inch are actually my favorite because then I don't have to think when I'm folding it over and sewing it on my quilt. I can just sew away and not worry about anything. So I've cut my strips. I cut them the width of fabric and don't have to worry about the bias at this time because my quilt is a square or a rectangle quilt. If you're doing a quilt that has any rounded edges whatsoever, you're going to definitely want to do a bias binding. So this binding has just been cut with a fabric. All right, to put my binding strips together, I like to use that mitered look. And so I do a 45-degree angle. I have placed this piece down with the right side up, and I'm going to take my next piece and I'm going to place that right side down perpendicular. And then I'm going to take my ruler and I am going to draw with a chalk mark because this is a nice dark fabric. I'm going to draw a line from corner to corner. And then I like to put my pins in so that I can take them out as I sew. If I have a nice table like this, I can then simply take this strip right here and I'm going to turn it so that it is right side up and that this is going right side down so that it's perpendicular. Draw my line, and I'm going to do that for all my pieces. For this quilt, I'm doing 6 pieces. One way to tell that I'm going in the right direction with my line is that I can stick my ruler right on that line and make sure that my fabric is going to be going in the right direction. You'll know pretty quick if you've taken that ruler and stuck it on there and it's not going in the right direction. I'm going to sew all my strips together by simply sewing on the chalk line right here. I have set my needle position to the center position and I'm simply going to follow that chalk line and take out my pins as I go. One of the ways that I know I'm in the right direction for my strips is that my tails are heading in this direction toward the inside of my machine. And my long piece is heading on the outside. So as I bring up my next piece, if my line is on the wrong side, then stuff's going to go on the inside that shouldn't. And so I can tell that I'm going in the right direction because my tails are in the going toward the inside. Once I'm done sewing all the strips, I go ahead and cut off the tails. I'm not really concerned about how much I'm leaving. I kind of leave like about ½ an inch there. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up all those tails. I don't want to push them to one side or the other. I want to go ahead and open them up. So having that nice ½ an inch makes it easy to do that if I can find an end. Okay, where are you, end? Okay. So, and while I'm at it, I can go ahead and iron out all those creases as well. And so I'm just going to iron open all those tails, and then I'm going to turn it in half lengthwise. Now I'm going to fold it in half. I want to line up those raw edges there and give it a nice iron. And on this end right here, I can go ahead and prep for the quilt, for putting this onto my quilt. So I can go ahead and I'm going to fold it in just like that, so that I sort of have that, 45-degree angle. I'm going to do it perpendicular right here, and I can go ahead and iron that just a little bit. And then I'm going to cut just this little tail off right here. And then I can fold this like this, and this will give me that wonderful look in the end of that nice mitered, clean 45-degree angle. And then I'm going to go ahead and iron the rest of the binding. For best results, it's easiest to use a walking foot when you're doing your binding. It is not absolutely necessary, but it certainly makes life easier. So a walking foot is a foot that allows the feed dogs to work with an upper feed dog system. So you can see how I have a feed dog here, and then you have your feed dogs on your machine here. And so what happens is we put this around your needle uptake, and that will force those feed dogs underneath to help push that fabric through, and it just makes for a much more even feed. And so to put on your walking foot, all walking feet are different, but for the most part, you have some sort of mechanism that needs to go on or around. In this case, it's around my uptake lever. My uptake lever is actually my needle, where I change my needle. So if I'm needed to change a needle, I can unscrew that, change my needle. That bar is where I want this to go around. And then I need to take off my entire foot, because this is going to replace everything. So in order to do that, I have a screw down here, and I just release that, and I can pull off my normal foot. Then I want to unscrew. Unfortunately, I have to unscrew this quite a bit in order to get my walking foot in there while I am getting my, I better move my fingers out of the way here so you can see, while I am getting my my bar around my uptake lever. And so it looks like I need to loosen it just a little bit more so I can get in there. I hate it when the screw comes out, so I'm doing my best to try and get it in there without removing the screw. So you just sort of, once I get my top piece in there, I just sort of wiggle, and there she goes. And so I want to make sure she's completely in there, just like that. There we go. Okay, so now that my walking foot is on, I am going to adjust my stitch length. Not my stitch length, I'm going to move my needle over so that I can get my 1/4 of an inch. And I know where my 1/4 of an inch is with my foot. You're going to have to play with your foot to find out where your 1/4 of an inch is. I'm placing the binding onto the right side of my quilt, and I have left the tail that I've prepared right here hanging off the side, or not hanging off the side, hanging off the back. And I'm going to go starting about 3 or 4 inches in, so that when I get around to the other side, I can simply tuck my end in and cut off whatever extra I have and continue sewing on. And so I'm going to line up those raw edges together. When I start, I always start with a bit of a back stitch just so that it's got that stress will not pull those threads out when I'm going to put the other end into this end. I want to stop 1/4 of an inch before the end of my row. So I'm going to stick a pin right in there. You don't have to stick a pin if you know where that 1/4 inch is, but I want to make sure that we know where that 1/4 inch is. So now we're going to stitch to the pin and go back a couple of pieces, and then you can pull the pin out. All right, then I pull the quilt out of the machine completely. I turn it and bring up my binding so that my raw edge is going straight with the raw edge of my quilt. And I have this nice 45-degree angle right there. And I'm going to hold this in place while I bring my binding back down so that my raw edges match up here on this side. I'm going to start stitching right at the very end of my row. And sometimes my feed dogs don't pick it up. Did this time. Yay! And then I get to start going all the way to the next corner where I do it all over again. I've reached the end of my quilt. And so now I'm going to take this tail right here and I want to tuck it in to the nice folded binding that I have right there. I just happened to end just perfectly and get it in there. And so I like to go ahead and pin everything in place. It's still in the machine because I can be able to and I like to just go ahead and pin everything nicely in place so that I can manipulate that a little bit more. And so I think I am going to cut off just 1 inch and then I can stick that right in there just like that. But I want to make sure that I have plenty of tautness when it comes here. And so I want to, that's why I pin in place, is just to make sure everything's going to stay. The other thing I like to do is to make sure that this area right here is really tucked in good. Here we go. Pin everything in place. And now I can simply start stitching. And I am going to stitch a little bit further because it was kind of over. I think I got caught on one of my feed dogs. So I'm going to go make sure that my stitching is okay at the beginning. I start folding over my binding at the area at the bottom of the quilt where I hooked everything together. This area is going to be the trickiest. So as I pull it over, I'm moving it into position, and then I'm going to bring in several binding clips so that it'll secure that area while I get everything else situated. I like to sew several inches above that area, so I go ahead and clip that in place as well. I am using a single strand of thread that I've already knotted. I hide my knot by coming up in the area that will be covered by my binding. Now I just grab a little bit of the binding with my needle and go into the same spot I came up. Then I can hide the thread inside the quilt, bringing up just a little of the binding each time. As you can see, I am going parallel to the fabric so that I can get inside the middle of the quilt. I have one finger on the front of the quilt, making sure that I don't go all the way through the quilt and I keep that thread in the center. Take it slow when you get to the bulk so that you can keep all those layers where you need them. And at this point in time, you can also adjust if you need to make sure all those layers need to move into a different position.
I get to the corner, as long as I have left that 1/4 inch before the end, I won't have any problems with twisting this right over and creating a straight line going just like that. And you can see I already have that nice fold at the end. I can bring this over just like that, and it gives me a perfect mitered corner. So I just stick my clip in just like that. And then I do a couple of extra stitches. Let me get to that corner here. Okay, see how I have the mitered corner just perfect right there? I am going to come up in all of those layers right there at the very tip. And then I like to go in and grab halfway through. So I'm going to go right in here and, well, it's a little bit more than half, but it gives a little bit more security at those corners. And now I can go straight in right here and continue on my way to the next corner. And then you can cut.
And here she is, the nice luminous blooms, all complete. You have learned how to do a mitered corner. You have learned how to use a panel in a 3-yard book. Have a blast making this quilt. If you would like to get the kit, you're welcome to look at our website, www.QuiltNCode.com, and we will see you soon with the next 3-yard quilt panel pattern. See you.